Welcome back everybody to the Sicilian Patterns Part 2 video. Please check the first video right now if you haven't seen it before. Every opening, folks, has typical and recurrent patterns and chunks around the middle game that we have to understand by heart to become really good at that opening. And Sicilian is one of the best openings out there. It's a complex one. That's exactly why we need this training on deeply understanding typical Sicilian motifs and patterns in the middle game. Thus, we'll become much better opening players. Even though we don't memorize everything move by move, which no human can, you can still rely on these typical and strong patterns that you learned to make good moves in your games. Okay, so that's a function of this series of videos. And this is the first part, Sicilian opening. I start with Sicilian because I'm a Sicilian player myself. And that's a very, very strong and counter-attacking opening, folks, that I want all of you to have some understanding of the typical ideas. You can also play the Sicilian with the white pieces. Maybe you're an e4 player. You will also benefit tremendously from these videos, okay? So this position was your homework from the first part. Remember, it was black's turn to move in this position. If you haven't done it yet, please stop the video right now, folks, and please formulate a good plan for black in this position. Black is a very strong plan that is around the weaknesses in the position, right? This is a very typical pattern. The king on b1, we have long-lasting pressure on the b file. The biggest problem for white is the pawn on b2. The question is, can we intensify our pressure on that pawn on b2? You're a great player if you came up with the move d5 in this position. You're awakening your bishop on e7, right? Every opening has very typical pawn breaks like this. In this case, the d5 pawn break, of course, typical in a Sicilian, which activates the bishop on e7. And now after takes, you tell me the next move. Obviously, right? Bishop a3, the pawn is pinned, and we put tremendous pressure on the weakest point around the enemy king. That's a beautiful follow-up. And here, you see, white is already having trouble in defending the pawn on b2. They can't go b3 because of this. Thus, the only defense seems to be knight a4, right? So after knight a4, again, I want you to find a great move for black in this position, folks. How do you intensify the pressure on b2? You're a great player, folks, if you came up with the move c3, bang. Utilizing the pin in both directions. That pawn on b2 is completely pinned and cannot move, and knight c3 doesn't work because of this, right? And things are collapsing. So c3 is yet another move that intensifies our pressure on b2. And you see the coordination? Every single black piece is pointing towards the pawn on b2. That's what you mean by your pieces helping each other in chess. c3 is a great move, and basically white is sort of forced to play knight e2, right? Just to be able to force us to take on b2 and show our hands. And here comes a great Sicilian pattern, folks. Please, can you please tell me whether c takes b2 in this position is a good move or not for black? Would you rather take that pawn with your pawn, or would you rather not even touch that pawn, right? So that's a question. Should we take on b2 right now, or should we ignore that pawn? And that's a very nice example, folks. You're a great player if you said don't take the pawn on b2. Why? Because if you take the guy, look at this. That's a mistake, because your pawn is now becoming an umbrella. Your pawn on b2 is acting like a shield, protecting the king on b1. Can you see it, folks? That's a very recurrent theme in the Sicilian. Don't do that, please. You want this b file to be open. Don't close the file with your own pawn in this position. That will be wrong. And that repeats itself so many times. I've seen many players go wrong here. Too much materialism, of course, right? Because you're winning a pawn. Here, it's all about activity and the king's safety rather than the extra pawn. White wants you to take on b2 with your pawn. You should not take the pawn on b2, right? Well, the best move in this position for black is knight takes d5. By the way, knight e4 is also a good move with the same idea, right? You intensify your pressure on c3. You also put some pressure over here. You see, it's also a great move. But we can also just win a pawn on d5 directly with the knight and we keep maximum pressure on the pawn on b2. Of course, this way you're also stopping, right? Knight takes c3. That's a great move, and here things are collapsing. I mean, if white tries the exchange sacrifice, you take it, and you remove back the queen. We have an extra exchange. Our king is still safe, by the way. More on that later on. Our king is very safe in the center. And, well, if they try king a1, we can even go for the final tactical sequence. You tell me, folks, what should black do here? You're a great player. If you can avoid the move, bishop takes b2. Bang! You're forcing knight takes. And, of course, queen takes c3. You won one more pawn. And black is having a clear advantage in this position. You can even castle short and take it from there, right? What did we learn from this example? Going back, right? Going back, b2 is hanging. You awaken the bishop first. You go directly to a3 and you refuse, right? You find c3, of course, and here you refuse to take that pawn. That's beautiful. If you take with the bishop, it's also is not the same, right? Because after this, well, you don't want to trade the queens here, so you have to take with the pawn, and then they will move the queen somewhere, right? And your pawn is a shield protecting the king on b1. Don't do that, folks, right? So we learned two very important patterns in a single example. You activate your bishop with d5, you fight for the weakest point, you put pressure, and you refuse to create an umbrella around the enemy king. Another very typical Sicilian pattern, folks. They take on c4 here. Do we take with the pawn or with the rook? You have two choices. How should black recapture this bishop on c4? Please take your time. Stop the video, folks. You're a great player if you came up with the move b takes c4 in this position, folks. Why? Because you're burying that knight on a1, right? Just look at this. This knight has no square to escape rather than a1. But I want you to focus on the poor knight on a1. That knight is an end-tone piece in its barn, and it's zero potential to come back into the game again, right? So this was the main point of b takes. Most players just automatically recapture with the rook, which is usually a good move, by the way, but it's not the same because the knight is alive in this position. So you see, you always make this judgment in terms of piece activity and restriction. After knight a1, the knight is out of the game, and you tell me the next move. Formulate a plan, please, for black. Yes, the plan is very simple, right? B takes also created this b file pressure, and you go queen b6 first or rook b8 first, and your next move is this, and you intensify the pressure on b2, just like the first example, folks, right? Now we are creating a plan. The white king is not safe, so you basically put pressure and you play this way, okay? Now, in this segment, I will talk about building your sense of danger in the Sicilian, because that's a very dynamic opening. That's a very complex opening. Could be very sharp. So you also have to breed this mindset of sensing the danger and taking actions accordingly, okay? That's a beautiful game of Vishwanathan Anand with the black pieces here. Black has two extra pieces in this position, should be winning, but the knight is hit, and you see the H file is open. So given your king is on g8, you have to be very careful in this position. So let's start doing some defensive puzzles, folks, okay? Just give yourself choices in this position. Tell me some ideas. What should black do in this position? How should we defend this position with the black pieces? Okay, you always have to be careful in those positions. Well, no matter where the knight moves, right? They are certain that this is coming. That's their next move. And they want to basically checkmate us on h8. You have to be careful. So the first one by Anand is designed to anticipate queen h3, and already here he's forming a defensive plan for black. I want you to stop video right now and take it almost like a real game, okay? How would you play with black in this position? You can give yourself even 10 minutes or something in this position to, really go deep, try to understand the situation and really solve your problems in a clear way. Let's do it together, folks. In this position, Anand first goes knight g4, and obviously he knows that queen h3 is coming. Okay, so now white basically wants to mate us on h8. How should black defend this position, folks? That's my final question to you. You're a great player if you find the entire sequence. Knight h6, of course, you're clogging the h file, and after g takes h6, what should black do here, folks? Yes, black should play g6, and he closes down the h file. The h pawn is an umbrella, is basically a pawn that is guarding and shielding our king on g8. A very typical and recurrent pattern. We saw this in a reverse context on the previous position, right? Just in the previous position, you were not supposed to create an umbrella. Here, you're forcing white by going knight h6 to create a pawn on the h file, which is just shielding your king. Your king is very safe. After h7, of course, you go to h8, and that pawn is still, right, blocking those white pieces. The white pieces would rather that pawn to disappear, but how can that disappear? There is no way. Black has the bishop pair for the rook. Black has the material advantage. Our king is safe, and black is obtaining a winning position. Now I will show you another very typical Sicilian pattern that you should be very aware as the black players. Sense of danger I'm talking about. Yeah, we are starting. That's a student game, by the way, with the black pieces. Mario, you're a great player because you show us some very nice Sicilian patterns in this game. But you see, Sozin, it's one of the sharpest lines, Bobby Fischer's favorite. And the Sozin, we had to be very careful about one particular move. Those moves are not perfect. I'm not so much worried about those. We are coming to a critical moment, okay? This knight d7 is a bad move, folks, and I want you to tell me why. What is the problem with this move, knight d7? Every Sicilian schoolboy must know this pattern to avoid disasters. The problem is this: you're allowing the typical bishop takes e6 sac. Well, yes, and you see what's going on, right? White takes 2 pawns for the piece, but this knight's an amazing piece. Will take on g7. Now white collects 3 pawns for the piece, and knight on f5 is amazing. Your king will be forever stuck in the center. Your king is weakened. His pieces are coming. He gained this d5 outpost. The bishop can go to g5. You don't want to play this position with black, okay? You don't want to end up in a position like this. So every Sicilian schoolboy must know this pattern. Knight d7. What's the problem? Your bishop was guarding e6. No longer, right? This looks like the most natural developing move, and that's why so many players fall for this. But you allow bishop e6, and it's almost always a great option for white. There is no real way for us to create counterplay, and you don't want to play this with black. Very difficult practically to defend. Okay? Just look. White player doesn't see it, by the way. He also needs to build his Sicilian patterns with white pieces, and he just ignores it. Black gives white a chance to go e6. He doesn't take. Black gives white the 3rd chance to take on e6. He doesn't take, right? 4th chance. He doesn't take. Oh my god. Oh my god. This is going really, really in bad directions. And now black gives white 1 more chance to take on e6. He doesn't take. And now white gives black a real chance to execute a great Sicilian pattern, folks. And here, please stop the video, folks. You saw this pattern in the previous video. I'm now checking whether you learned something or whether there was only an illusion of learning. If you really understood from the first video those patterns, I'm sure you will find black's move easily from this position. Bang! Soviet Sac, folks. You're a great player if you found the move very quickly. That's intuitive sacrifice. Why? Because white just gave us, right, a chance to destroy their structure around the king. Now the white king is very weak, and Mario, my student, he went for it because, of course, he learned this pattern. He's a new player, by the way. He's a very new Sicilian player, and he learned this pattern, and he goes for it. And you see how he's executing the ensuing attack. He castles his king. He takes his time. All the pieces will slowly come to the queen side with black. It's easier to play with black in this position, right? Now everything is clear. They're going to attack the enemy king. Maybe even, queen c7, rook b8 will be fine. Black could have kept the tension for the moment, but he goes for this directly, and now he opens up the b file, right? There's a clear logic behind this move, and you see what's going on. White craves to do something on the king side, but the black attack is coming first. Every single piece is now aligned on the queen side, and king a2 is a big mistake, of course. After king a2, Mario is showing his class, folks. He finds the move knight d5. That's a beautiful Sicilian motif, a counter-attacking move. He also says, you know what? If that knight will be captured, my bishop is joining the attack. That's a beautiful move, by the way. He takes d5. bishop takes d5 check. Well, the only move is basically c4, because if the king goes here, then you get mated, right? Look at this. Look at our pieces. So c4 is the only move for white, and then comes beautiful calculation phase. Queen c3, beautiful move, right? Queen b2 is a big mating threat, plus bishop takes c4 is a second threat. White has no chance to defend, and Mario won the game like this. The white player resigned after bishop takes c4 check. Beautiful game, folks. That's one of the beautiful games. And Mario, again, you're a great player, but what you need to get better in general, right, as black, is to see this pattern. Sense of danger, folks. This is very important to breed as Sicilian players. These motifs repeat themselves over and over again. You don't want to give this to white in this position. Let's talk about another sense of danger motif here, folks. I will give you two choices here. It's black to move. Would you rather play bishop c6 or castle short in this position, okay? It's a very typical Sicilian middle game pattern. How would you judge? How would you judge in this position whether your king will be safe or not on the king side? What are the signals for you? Maybe to become a little bit cautious about this, okay? Now we are talking about very typical patterns again. The problem with castle short here, folks, that's a bad move. The problem is this. You have this 8-6 pawn, which will serve like a hook that will allow white to open up lines on the king side, folks. You see it, right? That pawn will accelerate white's attack on the king side. Because of the hook pawn on 8-6, it will be a risky move to play castle short. White's pawn chain is pointing to the king side. Obviously, will go g4, g5 ASAP to open up lines. And this is why, in this position, you should not castle short, but play bishop c6. That's a great move. The bishop eyes the key square on d5, plus the bishop puts pressure on the weak pawn on e4. And again, the black king is very safe for the moment in the center. Why? Because how can white open up the center? Everything is locked, plus black has the central pawn majority, right? That usually serves like a shield in the middle game for our king. It's not so bad in this very locked structure because white has no pawn breaks, right, to open up lines anymore in the center of the board. So your king is momentarily safe. You take it. You take it from here. We can look at some moves, bishop d3 to defend. Then you can actually go for the queen side expansion with typical b5, b4, right? And if white basically wants to stop your b4 idea, then you also say, you know what? Thank you for giving me a hook pawn, and I will use that in the future to open up lines on the queen side. You're still refusing to go to castle short and put your king over there. If white insists in this plan, you can just insist on your counterattack. And if white insists on opening up lines on the king side with the move h4, because now g5 is coming, now you can take on g4 because that knight will be stabilized by the pawn move h5, and your king is still hasn't chosen its location yet, right? You will stabilize your knight on h5 and you will take it from there basically. Extra pawn for black, that's also hanging at some point, and you can always kick that knight away with b4, and the game is very sharp, but black is completely fine in this position. In the actual position, if you castle short instead, because of the 8-6 pawn, guys, g4 is coming with great force, right? And you don't want to take that pawn, correct? Because if you take that pawn, you see what's coming, right? You see what's coming at you, basically. I mean, this is a dangerous position to play. And if the knight drops back, then you allow moves like this, right? It's a complete disaster directly, by the way. I mean, this is just shows us, you know, how quickly things can turn in those middle games. So, yeah, after g4, since there's a pawn on 8-6, white will just easily open up lines and activate their pieces on the g file, right? While your attack on the queen side is not coming the same speed. And that's the problem. And that's why you should be very careful in a position like this to look at your hook pawns. Could be used like a hook pawn to open up lines for the opponent. And this way, right, you can judge whether your king will be safe or unsafe on the king side. Your king is very safe momentarily in the center of the board. You played flexibly. Now, finally, I will show you a motif in the Sicilian Rauzer to improve your sense of danger and to show you beautiful patterns in the middle game for both sides, folks. Please bear with me. We haven't looked so much about those Rauzer structures, which arises in the classical Sicilian, okay? That's a classical Sicilian with knight c6 instead of a6, and this presents itself with unique futures in the middle game. Of course, you go e6 here just to control that knight, because if you go e5, the problem is, right, since the knight's already pinned, you're inviting moves like knight e5. So now we'll actually future and see some very interesting Scheveningen kind of pawn structures. But already here comes my first question after f4, b5, bishop takes f6, okay? Sense of danger, please, folks. You have two choices. Do you take back with the g-pawn or with the queen in its position? You have two choices. Well, the good move is g takes f6, folks, okay? G takes f6, which is giving us this very typical, right, Rauzer pawn structure, as they say, which we'll study in some depth right now. Because if you take with the queen, what's wrong with this? Can you see what white can throw at us here, folks? Yes, e5. e5 is a very typical motif because white's pieces are already lined up against your bishop on d7. You can't take back that easily because you see what move white will throw at us here. Yes, knight takes b5, and you're facing enormous issues right now on the d file. This was the reason why you can't take back with the queen. You can drop back the queen to d8, but you see, you invite moves like this. It's not fun. It's not fun to play this position with black, okay? So, sense of danger. Now we actually have a better understanding of this. That's why after bishop takes, you take back with the g-pawn, okay? It looks like a weakening move. If you look deeper, your king will be safe in the center of the board in those structures. And we'll talk about this in some depth right now, folks. Queen b6, you hit the knight, takes, you take back with the bishop, of course, right? And you achieve this very typical formation. Black has the bishop pair, and those pawns protect our king in the middle of the board. And white, of course, wants to open up things ASAP in his position to punish the king in the center. But now comes my question to you guys. You have two choices. Should we push e5 and close down ASAP, or should we play the move b4 first? Okay, so you have two choices, e5 directly or b4. This connects to our first episode, first video, folks. We are forming connections. Well, you're a great player, folks, if you come up with the move b4 first, because you want to chase that knight away from d5 before you play e5. Because if you play e5 directly, right, the problem is this knight's already in the perfect spot to reach that outpost on d5. You don't want to allow this in this pawn structure, so you make this very typical b4 move first. By the way, that's one reason why you push b5, right? At the right moment, you can chase that knight away, which is fighting for the key d5 point. And now after knight moves somewhere, right, now you can go e5. Because right now, right, the white knight is far away from reaching d5. Just look how difficult for that piece to ever come to d5. And that's a very typical Sicilian pattern that you must know. That knight on e2 or on a4 is far away from the square. It's almost impossible, right, for the knight to reach here. Thus, you are very safe. Your weaknesses cannot be exploited. Plus, the bishop puts pressure on the pawn on e4. Plus, your king is very safe in the center of the board on e8 right now, folks, right? So that's exactly why you play this way. That's the reason. Now we're asking the why questions all the time in this series to have deeper understanding. Knight g3, they are defending their pawn, right? And here comes another very typical Rauzer pawn move in this position, folks. Maybe some of you know this pattern before. I will give you some time to stop the video, and please tell me that very typical pawn move in these structures. Yes, you're a great player if you come up with the move h5. Multi-purpose move. Maybe at some point you will chase that knight away with h4, but also, right, you're seeing the worst place piece can activate at some point. You also invite the move bishop h6 by going h5. That's a very typical pattern in this pawn structure. Okay, now we are learning a new pattern. h4, white wants to stop you from pushing h4, but then comes queen c5, a great move. Why? It's a prophylactic move. You're stopping bishop c4. The bishop was just about to enter this nice diagonal, right, which will put pressure on f7, the d5 outpost, and it could defend their king. So a prophylactic move, a very typical prophylactic move. You're stopping bishop c4. Beautiful move. Queen e2, well, the queen is sort of eyeing the pawn on h5. Should we be worried about that pawn on h5? I don't think so, folks. I don't think so. We can't defend the pawn anyways, but that pawn is the least concerned in its position. And here I want you to come up with a great move, folks. A great move that is actually potentially connecting your rooks and It's a move that defends your main weaknesses like d6 and f6. You're a great player, folks. If you come up with the move king e7, bang. The king is a very strong piece in the center of the board. Just look how safe the king is in this pawn structure. White has no pawn breaks left to shatter the structure and to punish the king in the center. That's a very typical pattern to remember here, folks. King e7, you're potentially connecting your rooks, and your king is also, just in case, right, defending your weaknesses so your pieces can go free. If they take on h5, which maybe they should, right? Because if they don't, what's White's plan? It's not easy to understand. If they defend, let's say like this, then you have a plan, right? You will push your pawns on the queen side. a4, b3, or maybe a4, a3, right? You'll basically create your pawn storm on the queen side. And the game plays itself. You can activate all your pieces later on, right? We have this very typical Sicilian play on the queen side. So White has to do something. Knight takes h5 is the only good-looking option. At least they're winning a pawn. But here we have choices. I very much like this idea of sacking the exchange with rook takes h5 and taking on d4 with tempo. The bishop get active. And here White has to be careful, folks, to defend this position. Rook d2 is one of the good moves probably because they defend the pawn on c2. But here, right, we can actually go on with our pawn storm, right? Basically, the pawn storm is raging on the queen side with a4, a3, a4, b3. It's all about the king's safety in a position like this, right? And your claim is very simple. Your king will be safe on e7 in this position. That's a very sharp Sicilian middle game that is fun to play, actually, for black. Bishop d3 is a good move. We don't trade the bishops because that bishop is a bad bishop for white. Why do we trade? Our bishop is a good piece. Rook d1, because white wants to go g4, g5. That's the only way to weaken our king on e7. But right now the pawn is pinned. That's why rook d1. But this gives us one crucial tempo, right, to create our pawn storm. White wants to do this, of course, and then comes b3 or a3. That's my final question to you guys. Should we go b3 or a3 in this position? This is a nice pawn storm quiz for you. The idea is, of course, right, to increase our attacking chances on the queen side. How do we attack the white king easily in this position? Which pawn move is giving us that? You're a great player, folks. In this case, if you went for a3, the main point is this. They can't go b3, right? What's our move, folks? You tell me. Of course, queen c3. And there is no way for white to prevent the mate on b2, right? So a3 is already a great move because you're opening up lines. You're putting pressure. If you go b3, what is wrong with this, folks? You tell me. You tell me what's wrong. Yes, they will first take and then they will go a3, right? And it's not easy for us to open up lines. His king is secure. He closed down everything. There's no queen c2. Maybe rook c1s are coming. You don't want that, right? So going back, that's a very instructive two-choice test. a3 is a great move for black. And white is to be so careful, folks, here. So careful. Probably the only move for white is to create some counterplay on the king side, right? But here, we don't take. We don't take on b2. We put pressure with queen d4. That's a great move. We create a mate in one thread. And after gf6, do you take the pawn or do you drop back to e8? Another two-choice task for you, folks. You're a great player if you avoided king takes f6, which was allowing a mate in one. It's always good to blunder check your moves, folks. But after king e8, your king is safe as a baby. Look at this. Look at the king on e8, right? No one can attack the king on e8. And, well, your attack is coming. White has to be so careful. Well, if they try c3, you can take. And after takes, well, rook b8 check is coming. Now it's going to be destruction on the white king. And here you can even take the pawn. But I very much like queen c5. It's basically a move that keeps all the pressure on the board. You don't take it directly. This queen is forced to defend against bishop h6. Everything is tied down for white, folks. Please pay attention. Every piece is tied down. They have no moves left. The bishop can even join the attack with moves like this. So you see, it's a collapse. If the queen draws back to defend, then now you can take. And then comes the final blow. It's black to play here, folks. And force resignation, basically. What's the move? Our worst place piece joins the attack with check. And it's complete destruction. Look at our pieces. Look at the enemy king. After this, bam, mate on the board, folks. And things are collapsing for white. beautiful game, right? It's a beautiful game. You can learn tremendously from such examples. Yeah. What did we learn from this example? Let's, summarize some points. Well, sense of danger, right? Queen f6 is not a good move because of e5. It's good to know those patterns. gf, there is nothing to worry about. Our king will be safe in the center of the board. Well, the game will be sharp, of course, right? You have to be careful. For example, if you go e5, the knight is very close to the e5. You don't want that. First, you chase the knight away, and then you close up, right? Beautiful, recurrent pattern in a Sicilian. Here you go h5, a very typical pattern. Multi-purpose move, of course. And then comes prophylaxis. Again, bishop c4, step by step, right? Just every single black move is so logical, actually. King e7, you defend everything, right? You connect your rooks potentially. Beautiful. And if they take the pawn, we have many options, maybe even bishop a6 directly. But I very much like this move because it becomes easier, right, to play with black those positions. White has to be so careful in defending the structure. Our king is safe, right? It will take a long time for white to open up lines. And even if they go g4, g5 and take, right, our king is still safe on e8 in those positions. So that's also, gives you something like your long-term chances in a position like this. And most importantly, you don't have phantom fears in a position like this, right? That's the function of this training. You don't have phantom fears. You're trusting your initiative on the queen side, and your king is very safe. Even here, right? Two-choice test was very nice for us to understand what is the move that is giving me chances to intensify my attack on the queen side. And then you understand a3 is a great move, and then white's position is difficult to defend, very difficult to defend. And then your king is, of course, very safe on e8. Look at this, right? The bishop is a great defender too, by the way, right? But also the bishop actually finished off the game very, very soon in the structure. Yeah, there are many ways for black, but this is quite nice. This is quite nice to go for. And then the game is already over after bishop h6. That's it for today's video, folks. I will continue this series. Sicilian is so vast, it's like an ocean. There is no way that I can finish everything in 2 videos. So this pattern series will continue. I already have some ideas about my next video. It will be probably about some minority attacks, typical. Should we exchange off our g7 bishop? When and why? Right? There are so many positional patterns that I also want to give to you as Sicilian players. Give me feedback, please. Do you want me to show you other patterns maybe I missed so far? But this is the general structure of this series. I truly believe in the value of learning your openings this way. Obviously, you also need memorization. You need rote memorization, of course, but you also always need the combination of things because at some point, you're on your own. You can't memorize everything. In those cases, you need to rely on these typical patterns that I show you in these videos, folks. If you like this video, please give me a like and subscribe. This way, I can continue producing similar content for you. Hope it's useful. I am doing it for you, folks. This is what I truly believe to be a great way of learning your openings. And I will catch you on the next video on Sicilian Patterns Part 3. Bye-bye.